let's go ahead and jump into it here. So I just want to start with a quick bio. My name is Michael Baker. I've done a number of projects over the years, 19 years in game development, starting in graduate school. I've done lots of projects, some based on big licensed properties and many much smaller, and lots of prototyping in between. Most of my time has been spent in design, tech art, and production. I'm a Unity certified developer and also a Pluralsight author. And as of this semester, I'm also faculty at UT in the brand new Department of Arts and Entertainment Technologies. A couple examples of projects I've worked on. This is an image from a sci-fi visual effects course that I did for Pluralsight. This is a more recent project, just a kind of a little 2-hour kit bash type project. I like to sometimes just to kind of test out engine features, utilize free assets, and just kind of throw something together, test shaders and work with post-processing effects. So that's what this is here. This is a screenshot from Infinium Strike, which is a PC game. I did mostly shader and lighting development for this, as well as a few other things for this project. This is one of my favorite screenshots from the game. This is actually when you lose. You basically control this giant ship, and if you fail, the whole thing kind of blows up. It's pretty fun in the failure kind of thing. And then this image here is from a more recent project, kind of an experimental game that I'm working on with a couple of artist friends. Okay, so capturing art direction is the emphasis of this talk. We're going to be looking at the post-processing stack primarily, but we do need a few other things to really kind of make art direction work, and so we will also have a look at some lighting tricks and VFX as well. Okay, so how do we go from this to this? It's actually quite easy. We just need to add these things I just listed, so some lighting, some VFX, some post-processing, just throw those in there. So we just start with a level, add some lighting, add some VFX, and then drop that post-processing in place, and boom, it's magic, right? Does it work that way? Yeah, not always, right? In fact, not really ever. So this talk is really about kind of techniques to get from that starting point here to an endpoint like this. Boom, you're done. Missed my joke. All right. Okay, so how do we actually do this? So a little bit of background here. I've been working in, as I mentioned, game development for a number of years now, and kind of splitting my time in the last decade or so between teaching and developing. And one common challenge that I run into with students, particularly artists who are maybe new to the medium or maybe just new to the process of game development, they kind of get stuck on the art direction part of it. They know that it's like this really important thing, and they've experienced game content which is really, really compelling, and they're making all this great stuff, and they're trying to sort of get it to that point where it's just amazing. And it can be a tricky thing to kind of push through. But there's a technical component, and there's obviously an artistic component as well. So one thing that seems to be very helpful is, in terms of utilizing art direction, is to find the story. So if you're lucky enough to work with a really great concept artist, or have really high quality previs, the story generally is already there, and you can just kind of implement it in the engine or in your medium. But we don't always have that, especially with the democratized system that Unity has provided. We have an order of magnitude greater number of developers out there now, and a lot of them are coming through pathways to game development which are not necessarily rooted in the arts. And so I think there's a kind of a large need to kind of figure out how to get the visuals there, basically. And then the other piece of it is we need to tell this story using engine features, right? Using kind of rendering tricks and the things that the engine provides, really. So lighting, VFX, and post-processing. So as mentioned before, sometimes art direction is very clear and detailed, right? An image like this is absolutely packed with story. There's plenty of detail here. I mean, this is, if you're lucky at some point in your career, you'll get to work with someone who can make things like this, for a project you're involved with. But sometimes we don't get to work with such amazing content, right? And so we don't necessarily have those benefits. And so we have to find a way to kind of fill in the blanks and really advance that content and kind of capture the essence of what it is. And then sometimes we don't really have any art direction at all. Sometimes the art director says something like, just make it look good or make it look great. You got this, artist, right? And I think anyone who's been involved in a couple of projects out there in any production scenario at some point has dealt with this, right? And maybe you're the art director and you're like, I just need to make this look good, right? And sometimes there's an external person who's like, just make it look good. And that's not necessarily helpful in terms of moving forward and really making beautiful looking games. So find the story. How do we do this? Let's look at an example. All right, so we're going to start with some concept art here. This image, by the way, I believe is in the gallery. Billy Wimblett did this concept here. This is from a project for pluralsight.com. We're building a kind of an entire game demo as instructional content at Pluralsight right now. So that's what this content is from here. So there's another one. A little more detail on this one, a little bit more kind of hint at a story. We've got some light coming out of a doorway. And then we have some photo reference. Sulfur mines there on the left, which are crazy if you've never looked into those. Some furry friends, stalactites, that kind of thing. Okay, so what did you see? Let's say you're an artist and you need to work with this concept and these images and make amazing things. You have to answer the question, well, what did you see? Did you see things like mist, bats, moss, that kind of thing? Or did you see an ancient cave where the sounds of chirping bats and crawling insects echo off the glistening rock walls as your eyes adjust to the darkness? The stale scent of mildew and earthly decomposition wafts through the air as a foul swirling mist becomes visible below. Right, so that's obviously a lot more story. It's still coming out of the same content, right? But that's a lot more actionable, right? We can actually use this to kind of build out our scenes and make decisions about the things that we need to add to our scenes, right? So let's have a look at an example. That is not the right scene. Okay, so this is the scene that we've been looking at here in the presentation so far. Let's see. I need to switch my input. New laptop. Duplicate. There we go. All right, a little dark, but we'll work with it. I'm just going to run the scene quickly here just so we can kind of see what the format is here. So these scenes are set up so we have a before and after. So we're going to be applying effects and things to the image on the right here. Okay. All right, so this is our starting point. These are just some art assets that were built for the project. We've got a little bit of basic lighting in the scene, not very much. And so we're just going to start adding some things here. So we're going to add some background sound, because that's always helpful, especially for establishing the feel of an environment. And we'll go ahead and drop in some lighting here. So there's our lighting kind of drop in. So obviously some of this stuff has been pre-built. And then we've got some fire effects that we'll add here as well. I'm going to go ahead and run this again. All right, we should have audio. I think I'm hearing it here. I don't know why it's not going through HDMI. That's probably it. Let's see. Stand by. Oop. Use that instead. Did that not work? Did I just set that as default? Technical issues, right? if I disable that. Oh, that's headphone. I don't know. Say that again. Take it off. All right. Let's see. So, well, all right. We need to move on here. All right. So imagine there's some thematic sound happening in the scene here. All right. So we've added our lighting and our effects, and things look a lot better for sure. So lighting and effects are obviously kind of foundational elements which need to be present for a compelling environment. All right, and let's add a few more things here. We're going to add some fog next. Fog is a lighting feature, as most of you probably know. So let's go to my lighting settings here, and I'm going to turn on fog. And then to see this, I'm in deferred rendering mode, so I do need to enable the post-processing stack here behavior or on the camera. So there's some fog there, and you can see this makes a really big difference. So if we just run this again here so we see full screen, obviously in the absence of any other lighting information, just having the fog there to reveal the depth of the scene really makes a really dramatic difference between these two scenes. And it's starting to kind of hint at or reflect the art direction, right? The concept and the photo reference that we looked at before. All right, let's keep working on this here. So we could use a few more effects, I think. We've got a little lighting streak here that we can kind of pull out of the doorway. That's actually just a little line renderer with a texture on it. And then we can add some rolling fog here down below. So we'll turn that on. And while we're here, we're going to add a few more particle effects. We've got some little water droplets that drop down from the ceiling. And of course, we have some bats because it's an underground city. We need bats, right? It's a natural thing. So obviously, right? It was in the reference, so we've got to get it in there. Okay. All right. So there we are. So definitely looking a lot better. Again, if you compare before and after, we've done quite a bit to really kind of bring the scene to life. Effects are one of those things that really can add quite a lot to a scene. So we're getting there, and it looks okay. It looks pretty good, but it could definitely be better. So now we're going to take a look at the post-processing stack and see what we can do there. Okay. So for those of you who are not familiar with this is a relatively recent addition to Unity's image effects offerings. There are a few different flavors at this point available for the engine. And this post-processing stack is really fantastic. It allows us to apply effects to a scene that are really rooted in photography. So for those of you who were in the keynote last night, you heard Adam talk about the language of film, language of cinematography, those sorts of concepts. The post-processing stack is like a subset of that, basically. It's like the language of photography specifically. And so most of the effects in here have to do with concepts like exposure, color balance, depth of field and lensing, lens artifacts, grain, right? Those kinds of things that we're very accustomed to seeing those just being exposed to screen-based media for our whole lives, right? Okay, so let's see what we can add here. So we're going to turn on anti-aliasing. And for this scene, I do like the temporal anti-aliasing version. Seems to do a really nice job. A little ambient occlusion will also help, so we'll check the box there. The default is probably pretty good. You can see as we toggle there's a little bit of a difference. Might crank up the radius a little bit here. And the intensity a bit. All right, a little bit of an effect there. So we're getting a little bit more out of that. Again, the anti-aliasing really just smooths out all the geo edges. And then we're going to add some bloom. So just by turning that on, you can see we're getting that kind of characteristic bloom effect. Essentially, it's an overexposure simulation here through the lens of the camera. That always helps. And then the big one here is going to be color grading. So we're going to turn on color grading. And this is currently set to the ACES preset. This is a really nice, high-quality tone mapper, which really does a lot for kind of remapping the tone values in the render into kind of a more pleasing range. There's a lot of science behind what this thing actually does, but pretty much just know that it works really well. And what we'll do here is we're going to just bump the exposure up a little bit. You can see that we did lose some luminance, so we'll just bring that up a little bit, maybe right around 1 or so. So just kind of bring those values back. And then a couple other options we have in here which are pretty useful. we can shift the color temperature here, so we can give this kind of a warmer or cooler feeling here. This scene is actually pretty well balanced. We've got a lot of blue in the background. We've got this sort of gold light in the foreground already, so I'll probably just leave that the way it is. And then the saturation slider is another one that can be helpful. So this scene is a bit stylized, so sometimes we want stylized imagery to be kind of pop a little bit and have a little bit more intense color. So we could bring the saturation up there. It definitely gets pretty blue, so just do a little conservative adjustment right there. Otherwise, I think that looks pretty good. A few other things we can add here that may help the scene are chromatic aberration. So what this does is it kind of pulls the corners of the frame, and this just simulates basically focus accuracy problems with lensing. And so in this particular environment, because it's sort of a closed-in cave environment, like using effects to sort of like vignette and kind of distort the corners feels right, because it's sort of this dark space, kind of enclosed space. So we'll bring that up a little bit there. And we'll also add vignette. So there's vignetting right there. That just darkens the corners of the screen. And then the grain is nice as well. So there's our grain. I'm going to bring down the size a little bit and drop the intensity just a bit. So something like that. And we should have a pretty good result at this point. Let's run this again. Blue might be a little bit hot right now, but that can be adjusted, obviously. So that's kind of the basic process, right? And again, the emphasis here is that the decision-making process really comes from utilizing the pre-visualization materials, right? Utilizing the concept. Whether it's phenomenal, amazing concept art that's packed with story, or photo reference, right? Or an art director saying, just do it awesome. Like you need more information in there so you can start making decisions about like how you address the scene, like what to add to it, and really how you utilize effects like lighting particles and post-processing. So yeah, not a bad final result there. Okay, let's try another one. Okay, here we go. All right, we're going to do it again. Find the story. So we've got a desert environment. Lots of sand, texture, light. Okay, what did you see? Sand, sky, dust, that sort of thing. A camel, right? Or did you see a scorching desert where, exhausted, you pause for a moment, squinting at the dusty horizon where the setting sun casts long shadows across an endless dunescape? Spelling error there. Desperate for water to quench your thirst and rinse the grit from your teeth, you slowly resume the desolate trek as soft sand gives way beneath your tired feet. So again, I'm just sort of injecting story into what was really a pretty limited set of photo reference. How many of you work from photo reference, by the way? Just show of hands. Yeah, like almost everyone in the room, right? Yeah, it's kind of the way things go now. And sometimes, I didn't mean to do that. If you don't, again, have a concept artist to work with, then photo reference is really the next best thing. But again, utilizing it can be challenging. All right, so let's just go back to our stopping point there. Boom. All right, so let's do another scene here. Okay, so same setup as we had before. Oops, not showing up. Computers, right? Duplicate. All right. You'll have to imagine the audio, right? So from those amazing stories that we're telling here that I'm kind of talking about, like, just imagine the audio. All right, so same setup as we had before. So we have left and right, before and after. So it's a very basic scene. This is just a standard Unity terrain with a texture on it, and we have just a standard procedural skybox and one directional light. That's it. Okay, so let's start turning on some stuff in here. There's my background sound. I don't know, it's probably not going to work, but there's that. All right, so let's look at our fog again. So fog is one of those things that when you're dealing with an environment, really whether it's large or small, can really help again, add depth. In the old days, kind of prior to the Renaissance, this effect was actually known as aerial perspective or atmospheric perspective. And before perspective reconstruction was invented, like that was the only way that, like in paintings that depicted environments or depth, it was the only way they knew how to like visually communicate that there was depth, like that there was one thing in front of another, basically. So anyway, fog is a good one. So now that that's turned on, we're going to go to our camera here and just turn on the post-processing stack. So a little bit of a difference there. You can see that fog in the background on the right there. It's just a subtle kind of hint of some depth there. And the other thing I'm going to do is kind of a cool trick here. So we have a directional light in the scene. And one thing that is characteristic of kind of bright, raking light that kind of rakes across the landscape, so think like late summertime kind of light, or if you spent time, say, in Death Valley. The light tends to kind of break up as it's kind of raking across the surface, so we get like streaking. It's that characteristic kind of light streaking that we've all seen, right? So there's a kind of a cool trick here in Unity. You can actually use a cookie to do this. So I'm going to drop a cookie here on my light source, and then I'll just bump the intensity a bit here to balance that out. So right about there. And let me just run this here, and we'll look around a little bit. All right, so again, left and right here, you can see that kind of streaky light effect here on the right. And so this light cookie is actually just a clouds texture generated in Photoshop, just gray and white, basically. And so this is a really, really effective trick here for, again, just kind of adding a little bit more detail to the light as it's coming across the surface there. So, all right, so there's that. And you can see the fog as well. You can see it in the distance there on the right. Again, it's just adding a little bit more sense of depth and just kind of atmosphere. Okay. So, getting better. All right, another thing we can do with this light source is we can add a lens flare. So I've got a lens flare component attached to this directional light. I'm just going to turn that on and maybe crank up the brightness a little bit. So these lens flares are really effective if they're used correctly. There are lots of lens flares out there that are not really used correctly. But when they're attached to a light source that is visible in the camera, or in this case, the directional light, which is actually pointing at the camera, it is appropriate for some flaring to happen. That is a thing that happens with lenses. Your own eyes will even do that, which is why you shouldn't stare at the sun. But this can really, again, kind of help make the scene feel more natural. So the lens flare, again, it gives us a little bit of a kind of a brightness boost around the light source, and it also, we see some, again, simulated kind of flaring artifacts on top of the render. So that's helpful as well. We're going to add a little bit of dust to this as well. So we've got some rolling dust here, which kind of blows through. Again, it just helps add to the environment. It'll become visible when we run it again. Now let's take a look at our post effects. Okay, so here we go again. We're going to add that anti-aliasing. Again, I'm going to use the temporal version. It seems to work well, especially when you have camera movement. It works very effectively. Ambient occlusion in this case doesn't really do anything in the scene. It's so large, and there's not enough kind of surface proximity to make occlusion really do anything. So we'll leave that off. And we're just going to work our way down the list here. A little bit of bloom is helpful. It's a little bit bright there, so I'm going to go ahead and actually drop, or rather increase the threshold a bit. That looks pretty good there. A little bright, but that's okay. The sun is bright out in the desert when it's hot. And then we'll go to our color grading here. So we'll turn this on, and we'll go back to that ACES preset. And we can adjust the exposure. Exposure is probably pretty good. I might bring it up just a little bit. And now I've got to make some more decisions here. So we have this really hot, kind of dry, dusty environment, right? It's 120 degrees out. It's pretty oppressive out there. And so we're trying to kind of recreate that feeling, right, of being in that environment. And this will work, by the way, whether or not this is a first-person, game, or third-person, right, or a top-down. Like when you're trying to kind of recreate the sense of place, right, or sort of the feeling of an environment, it really doesn't matter like what the vantage point is, right? Again, you're trying to make it sort of feel natural and feel right, and compelling, ideally, to the player. So, Okay, so we're going to use our color temperature in this case to shift this over to a slightly warmer value. So we'll just brighten that up a little bit. Again, it's kind of golden hour here, so I just want it to feel a little bit warmer, right? So we just use a warmer color a little bit there. And then in this case, increasing the saturation seems to work well for the scene. I often recommend for like realistic scenes that you decrease saturation a little bit. But because the world is kind of dirty and gross most of the time, and so just dropping that saturation can make things kind of feel a little bit more natural in some cases. But increasing it in this scene seems to work pretty well. We kind of get the blue of the sky back. And this color of the sand we're getting on the right also feels pretty natural. So there's that. And we can also increase our contrast a little bit as well. We need to be careful about our exposure, so I'll probably drop that just a touch. So again, increasing contrast is consistent with like a single strong lighting source in the scene. Of course, we do have a kind of a bright blue sky, so there's plenty of ambient light in the scene. But just to try to reinforce this idea that like there's this really, really intense, hot light source kind of coming into the environment, we just bump that contrast just a little bit there. All right, and now in this case, I will avoid using vignetting. Chromatic aberration could also help. In this case, this again is a way of, if you have kind of an oppressive environment, you know, that's like really cold, really hot, really kind of closed in, aberration in the corners of the frame can help kind of reinforce that feeling of being kind of like controlled by the environment, just a sort of a sense of oppression. But I don't want to vignette this because, again, if I turn that on, it starts to feel kind of wrong because it's supposed to be really hot here, right? Ideally, we'd have like a white vignette we could put in the corners. So I'll leave that off for now. And then a little bit of grain will also help. So I'll just turn that on and just drop the size and adjust the intensity. Grain is kind of like dusty, sandy, right? It sort of works with this kind of a scene here. All right, so let's run this again. Okay, so here's our pretty close to our final scene. The color saturation might be a little bit much. Right now you can see we're picking up some yellows there in the sky. So that could be adjusted maybe. But again, if you kind of compare the two, you can see our rolling dust in there as well. It's definitely starting to feel better, right? It's sort of closer to that, you know, that original theme, at least based on our reference materials as well. So, all right, I'm starting to run a little short on time here. So I did have another one. If you'd like to see it, then you can, it is lunchtime, so if you want to see, you can come up and we can just do it right here. Or if you find me around the conference, I'm happy to show you the other demo. But let's wrap up our PowerPoint here. All right. So the other one was going to be a winter environment, which are really fun to do. Let's get through those. All right, so kind of closing thoughts here. So if you are not a concept artist, but you're an artist, right? Or maybe you're responsible for building the visuals in your game and kind of working on that side of things. There are a few things you can do to kind of help develop this sense of story and sort of start thinking more like a kind of a concept artist or a storyteller. Obvious things like a drawing or a painting class are very helpful. I'm sure many of you have already gone through those. Photography and cinematography is actually very, very useful. There's a lot of things you gain from kind of coursework in this category. Photography, obviously, you get a sensitivity to kind of lensing, framing, light, those sorts of concepts, which also gives you some insight into how the post-processing stack is intended to work. And then cinematography is, again, photography is sort of like plus time, and so it's sort of more storytelling, gets a more sense of like kind of sequence and just, again, the language of kind of storytelling on a screen. Observation is a huge one, right? So like just being observant about things is really, really helpful. So, you know, if you're responsible for lighting or effects or something in a project, just kind of slowing down and like putting your phone down and like observing the world a little bit can be really, really helpful, right? Take note of like how light works on surfaces and how texture is revealed and the differences between different times of day and those kinds of things can be really, really helpful. Art museums are another one. Those are big, obviously. Just exposure to other types of kind of visual medium and really other types of mediums, right, are very helpful as well. And then another one I find to be pretty valuable is travel. Something about traveling. It's like things sort of look different. They're unfamiliar. And so, at least personally, I tend to notice details that I don't normally kind of in my day-to-day routine. So, All right, that is the end of the show here, folks. I don't think we have time for questions. If you have any questions about this stuff, or you want to reach out, if you see me at the conference, certainly I'm happy to chat with you. And if anybody wants to see the final demo, I can just do that right here before lunch if you like. So, all right, thank you.